So maybe I will get started. Welcome everybody to our August AI webinar series that we run at Academy XI. My name is Amir Ansari. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at Academy XI, but also I run an applied AI portfolio of training products. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, which is the land of Melbourne, on which I'm coming to you from. And I would like to pay my respect to the past, present, and emerging leaders, and also extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Quick bit of intro on people who don't know Academy XI. Hopefully most of you do. Our mission is to transform the world through education by empowering community of change makers. So we're an adult education digital skills company based in Australia, but we do work globally for both enterprise and consumer business. In terms of our portfolio of training, we do work around business, technology, and design. And obviously our applied AI training and workshops, and this webinar series falls within our tech portfolio. But we also do bespoke training for emerging technologies as they come. In terms of AI workshops, in case you're interested, this is the only plug I'm going to give today, is we've got our half day and full day fundamentals workshops, which is really great for people who need to get the foundational understanding, which I think is really important. And we also have AI portfolio and AI training for business leaders, as well as more sort of technical based AI training and syllabus as well. That was a quick intro, David. So who we've got with us today? So good old David Bacon. Not only do I love his surname because I'm a sucker for all things bacon, he is a good friend of mine. I've known him for many, many years now. David's tagline is weaving humanity into technology. And his last gig was the director of design at a global consultancy called CINT, which acquired a company called Transpire, which both David and I both worked at many years ago. And he's previously worked at Telstra Health and other consultancies and agencies. And he's been in the digital age for well over 20, 25 years. Clearly, his facial hair doesn't give away his age, or maybe he's done that on purpose, as opposed to my salt and pepper. But David's going to talk to us about all things AI and ethics. Couple of things. Please use the chat. If you just wanted to have a bit of a chinwag, I will ask you, just for David and my benefit, just in your chat, tell us your role so we have a good sense of who the audience is. But please put your questions in the Q&A if possible. And then we'll aim to spend the last 10, maybe 15 minutes addressing as many of the Q&A as we can. All right, thank you. I can see people starting to put some stuff in, so fantastic. Without further ado, David, I'm going to hand the screen share baton over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. We are recording this session, but we typically don't distribute. It's more for David and I, or us, to be able to sort of work on some content, but please reach out to us if anything stood out to you. Sorry, David, back to you.
That's okay. So yes, as Amir said, I have spent a couple of decades working in the digital products and services. I've worked consultancy side and client side. My experience, I guess, with AI started about 10 or so years ago when I was working in health, and we had a predictive algorithm. And I was working clinical safety office, and we were having a discussion. And I now realize, but at the time we didn't have the language, but we were talking about privacy considerations. We were talking about concerned about the bias of the algorithm. We didn't necessarily have the language that we have now to discuss that, but that was my first experience. And then I guess fast forward and the explosion of AI in the last couple of years, we sort of not only we started to develop these frameworks and we had this sort of language to do, but one of the things I realized is my skill set was, as someone who was used to designing, I guess, for values and principles, for the designers on board, we have been asked to design for trust. We've asked to design apps that will delight or engage people or distract people. We have asked to design things that sort of demonstrate care or people feel supported by. So we're used to designing things and creating these experiences based on that language. And that's probably was my, is what you're going to see a lot today, was bringing those skill sets and those activities and things that I've learned, and to say, okay, how do we do that? But how do we actually apply, rather than sort of, I guess, product principles, we're actually designing with ethical principles. Okay, so now let's start ethics, because as I like saying, nothing says I'm fun at parties like bringing up the moral implications of computer programs. So this talk today, it's going to be about 30 to 40 minutes. And I guess what I want to say is that a lot of people now, particularly with AI, we're talking about compliance, we're talking about regulation, but I see there's a genuine opportunity to actually develop competitive advantage for products and organizations who are these first movers, and start introducing sort of these ethical frameworks in where they're working with. I want to start by saying I read a book last year by Ethan Mollick. He's an academic who studies innovation, and he writes in his book, Co-Intelligence, I believe the cost of getting to know AI, really getting to know AI, is at least 3 sleepless nights. I don't know what your experience was, but the first time you started using a large language model by ChatGPT, but it was something extraordinary. I think I probably fed in a transcript and maybe asked it to summarize it, or asked for a poem or a song or a lyric. And I've used it for a workshop outline. I was just playing with it and asking these questions. And I thought, I'm dealing with something completely new. It was almost alien. It was this weird thing. And I had this reaction as part of that excitement, is like, this is something new, but also part of that fear of like, things are going to change. And this is almost borderline crazy. And that's what Ethan Mollick was referring to, those 3 sleepless nights. Well, I think that if we start to introduce ethical frameworks, and we start to bring in that sort of ethics into the conversation around AI, and we can have that discussion about the impact it means on me and my job and the change, we can manage that change. I actually think we can sort of hopefully return back to sleep, and we won't have those sleepless nights. So at its core, ethical AI is about considering the impact the use of AI systems will have on real people. Now, a lot of people think ethics is philosophical, but ethics are actually not just a philosophical concept, but they're actually a practical tool that can actually help inform all the actions in different aspects of our lives. Now, ethical frameworks, particularly in technology, can help steer organizations in crafting innovations that benefit humanity while avoiding harm and inequality. So think about ethics as something like a steering wheel rather than like a barrier. It'll help sort of guide us move through. It'll give a structure for better decision making, especially when it might be difficult to choose between the right course of action. And this is when that murkiness starts to appear, or where you've got 2 options. Ethics can help us sort of have those discussions and decide on the best course to take through. And as well as helping us those decisions, I really think ethical AI is just smart for business. It can help minimize your legal risk. It can help protect the reputation of the brand and the organization. And most importantly, it can start to build trust with the customers and stakeholders who are engaging with that. So if you have sort of clear ethical principles, it will actually chart the course where you can move through. And then and help navigate the complexity of AIs, and make sure that these considerations and what individuals in the organisation deem important are integrated to every step of the way. Now, ethical AI, it is a subset of responsible AI. I'm not going to talk about responsible AI today. I'm just specifically talking about ethics. But there's also, I guess, interchangeable terms: responsible AI, accountable AI, safe AI, trustworthy AI. They're all, I guess, for part of it is you need to use the language that works for your organisation. But we also have to make sure that ethics actually has its own unique path in it, and it's not subsumed by these other things that will happen as we move through. And you'll understand as I move through. Okay, now, I guess looking at the changing landscape, regulatory landscape, and what's happened, a lot's been happening recently. But I want to take you back to the 1960s, and there was an article in Science magazine, and it talked about Norbert Wiener. He wrote this article, and it was about ensuring automated tools incorporate the values of their creators. And it was the first time, I guess, anyone had talked about trying to put ethics or principles into technology. So he started something called cybernetics, and that moved through. And then more recently, there's been the deluge of, I guess, people trying to bring in sort of that framework and governance around AI and ethics. Started in 2017, Canada and Japan kicked off with their AI strategy, followed closely by Germany, South Korea, and India. GDPR, that has a role in AI as well through data protections. That is 2018. One of the big things for me was in 2019, when the Australian government reduced the Australian AI ethic principles. We'll talk a little bit later, and I'll show you how I've used that in my practice. There is a National Institute of Standards and Technology risk management framework has been introduced. You would have heard about the EU AI Act being introduced. The US has an executive order. So there's lots of things coming in that's trying to provide guidance and trying to reduce the risk. AI ethics is still should underpin this and becomes a foundation, but there's lots of things. So I guess part of this is to say lots of things are happening. This isn't a one-person thing. As we move through, you'll understand that you actually need to work with legal and regulatory and governance to actually sort of like deliver this sort of ethical and responsible AI. If we look at challenges with AI, the conversations I have tend to fall in probably about three major buckets. There's bias, there's privacy, and explainability. And I just want to take you through some examples, I guess some fails where people haven't done, and it's probably because they haven't had that ethical, responsible framework in place. So let's start with bias. So bias, when translated into, like human bias, AI bias, when it's translated into actions or decisions, it becomes discriminations. And like many forms of discrimination, AI bias disproportionately impacts communities that historically or presently have faced oppression or have been underrepresented. An example with Amazon, lots have written about this. In 2018. They developed an AI-powered recruiting tool to help streamline its hiring process because they employ so many people. However, the system showed bias against female candidates for all their technical roles that they're hiring for, because the AI had been been trained on the resumes over the last 10 years. Most of the resumes had come from being from men, so which reflects the male dominance in the tech industry. So as a result, when the AI system saw resumes that would included the word women, or might have referred to a all-women's school or college or university or something like that, there was feminine language, it'd be penalized with this. Amazon very quickly took this sort of hiring tool out and looked at that. The other challenge I want to talk about is the Apple credit card. I don't think it was ever made available in Australia, but a few years ago they launched it in the US. And on Twitter, Steve Wozniak claimed that both he and his wife applied for an Apple card, and he received 10 times more credit on his Apple card compared to his wife. And this was despite the fact they had no separate bank account or credit card accounts or any separate assets. What they identified as she was female. Became lots of discussion around why did this happen, and they sort of talked about it, but there are lots of challenges if you do look at it and see they actually had fails in the area of bias, accountability, and things like that moving through it. So bias is a biggie. A third of businesses, so according to a DataRobot survey they did in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, a third of businesses have actually had impacts due to AI bias. 62% have lost revenue, 61% have lost customers, and 43% have lost employees. And this is a few years ago, so it's not a recent thing, so it is still impacting. So when there is bias in it, it does have significant impact to the business. I guess the next thing after bias, we're looking at privacy. Here's an example from Facebook a few years ago. They allowed Cambridge Analytica, which was a political consulting firm, to harvest personal data from millions of Facebook users without their consent. And this was then used to create targeted political ads, potentially influencing the election outcomes. And I guess this just highlights the risk of inadequate data protection and privacy controls in AI-driven systems. The fact they could scoop it all up and then sort of then use that where people didn't know their data was being used that way. And I guess this last big challenge we're looking at is explainability. Now, one of the things I do is I look at things to try and explain what it does, is I ask people to play a little game. I don't know if you're like me, but I was glued to the TV for 2 weeks watching the Paris Olympics. And one of the things we can turn around and say, okay, I'm going to run a little exercise, a little competition here, a little game, that if you get the answer right, you get $100. And if I get the answer right, you owe me $100. And so the question would be, who is the best Olympic athlete? Now, so you could then turn around. Normally, I would ask people to start dropping in their answers and things like that. You might say Simone Biles, or you might talk about Marchand. But I'm going to tell you the answer. Of course, it was Ray Gunn, the breakdancer, because my criteria was, everyone's still talking about Ray Gunn. Everyone's trying to sort of do her moves. And I guess here's an example of, because I didn't explain my ideas as to what is my criteria to do it, how do I go against it? It was unfair. You were never going to win $100. Here's an example. It was IBM Watson Oncology. They developed an AI system to help doctors make treatment recommendations for cancer patients. Now, this system was trained on some really good data from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. However, when it was deployed in other parts of the world, particularly in South Korea, the doctors found that many of its recommendations didn't align with its own judgments or local treatment practices. The key here was there was a lack of explainability. People couldn't understand what process it did to come up with those decisions, and what was the reasoning behind it. So they couldn't work out how to understand it or to try to validate it. This is an example of what so many of us have heard. It's called something like the black box. And this makes it difficult for medical professionals to trust or to effectively use. And I'll talk about trust at the end, because it becomes a really big thing, and it's a theme you'll see again and again when people are engaging with AI. Ethics is not an afterthought in artificial intelligence. It is at the center of how we will define and engage with AI. I really like this quote. It's from computer scientist Phi-Phi Lee, who has been called the godmother of AI. She's done so much in this space and written so much, but as she talks about it, is just making, how do we put it at the center of what we do? It's not a checklist at the end to say, okay, have you checked for bias? Have you checked for human principles? Have you checked for transparency and explainability? She said, no, she understands this AI almost better than anyone else. And she said, you have to put ethics at the core or the center. So if we're going to put it at the center, how do we start? Most of the time when you start raising, you say, hey, I'd like to talk about AI ethics, you start to sort of get these are the sort of responses you will get from executives and stakeholders or key people. They'll talk about things saying, we're already compliant with data protection, so we don't have to worry about privacy. Or they could say things like, our models are based on objective data, so the data is fine, you don't need to worry about that. You could talk about things like saying, we're not using AI for critical decision-making. And I get this a lot. They're saying, hey, listen, it's not sort of high risk. It's not, we're talking about not financial decisions. People won't get a loan. However, this ignores the fact that growing publicly, people are concerned about AI ethics, and they're worried about overlooking the potential to have these challenges or these issues, actually implications happen in low risk situation. Also can say things like, it'll slow down innovation. And the last one is just people say, like, our customers aren't asking for ethical AI. And I guess that actually reflects that the stakeholder or the person you're talking to probably doesn't understand the growing uneasiness or concern that people have around AI. So I guess the response to that, when people sort of share their concerns, is I see there is like basically 5 reasons for trying to, for business engaging with ethical AI. The first one, it's the right thing to do. It's like accessibility and universal design and inclusion. It's the right thing to do. However, trying to say something like that, people tend to look and say, okay, you need a bit more substance. So you can start to talk about risk. You can talk about regulations. You can talk about the people concerned about getting fines, and in some of the new regulations coming up, there are very significant for fines for people if you breach that. We can talk about legal costs. We can talk about trust. You can talk about avoiding risk to brand. You can talk about improving trust with clients and stakeholders. And then the last one is business benefits. One of the big things I see about this, and this is probably why I've engaged with people, is that it helps you scale AI responsibly. It helps you that sort of long-term planning. It can really help with in employee efficiency and productivity. And the other thing is actually, this is starting to come out now, that it actually can support environmental, social and governance efforts. So those ESG efforts, they can actually be supported by AI. So there's this growing business case for implementing AI with appropriate levels of governance to ensure its ethical deployment, development and use. And according to IBM's CEO Guide for Generative AI, companies that focus on implementing generative AI with the appropriate guardrails may be 27% more likely to achieve higher revenue performance than their peers that do not. So people are starting to say this is actually not just it's not nice to do, it's the right thing to do. They're actually saying you are more likely to achieve those sort of business benefits, which I think anything we do in this space, it actually has to have that business benefit, and we have to consider that. So if you've moved through at this point and said, okay, we've understood what the justifications are, we've tried to identify what the business benefits are, and someone says, right, let's start talking ethics. What do we do? Well, I see people sort of generally will go off, there's two paths. The first thing, they'll turn around and say, let's create some high-level statements. These things that make us feel really good, they reflect who we are, that's really good. Or the other thing is they will drill down and go, let's go to granular risk assessments. I see challenges with two of those things. If you just do those high-level statements, but you actually don't do the work behind them to say how they'll be implemented, why we're doing it, and what will it look like, it won't go anywhere. And also, if you drill down to the granular risk assessments, you can then get to the point it gets way down in that sort of that compliance, that checklist. It's very hard to do, but it also means that people, when they're engaged day to day with AI and they're building things, it becomes very arduous to go back and say, oh, wait a sec, what am I doing? Let me run by the checklist, because they don't have these sort of, I guess, these guiding design and development and product principles that they can follow. So what are the options if sort of neither of them work particularly well? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the books I read. If you're looking for something to read, it's called Ethical Machines by Reid Blackman. He lays out a 4-step process. And he talks about this 4-step process to help you, I guess, to make sure your AI doesn't do bad. He talks about step 1. He says, state your values by about thinking about your ethical nightmares. So he said, the ethical nightmare says, these are the things you're going to really be concerned with. I found this really effective when you start to exec saying, what are you worried about? Data scientists, they're actually really good. They're worried about ethical nightmares and will actually be working quite hard and they're probably not documenting or visualizing what they've done, but they will have things they're concerned, and that's what they'll be working to try and mitigate or prevent. So your ethical nightmares will depend on what industry you're in. Reid gives an example for a healthcare provider. He says, this might be a healthcare provider that uses AI to make treatment recommendations to doctors and nurses. And their concern is there's widespread false positives or false negatives in testing for life-threatening illnesses. That's their ethical nightmare. So he said, your value at that point, you might extract, might be saying, okay, well, let's do no harm. That would be your value you're working with. The next step he talks about is to explain what you value in a way that connects to your organization's mission and purpose. Because if you can't weave your ethical risk mitigation standards and your principles and your values throughout your AI strategy and your product lifecycle, then employees will regard it as a nice to have, and this program will fall by the wayside, and your ethical nightmares we realize. I mean, just think about the digital projects we're doing. When we understand if these transformation projects, how it's tied into the company's overall strategy, what a mission is, it just makes that team understand what part they're playing in helping that organization achieve those goals. So if we come back to our healthcare example, so how would they weave or connect the value, their business value to do no harm to the company's vision? He said something like, we are first and foremost healthcare providers. We are entrusted with one of the most sacred things on this planet, human life. More specifically, each and every one of our patients trust us to take the best care of them we possibly can. Now, while speed and scale are important, it can never come at the cost of decreased quality of care. The next thing he talks about is connecting values to what we talk about is ethically permissible. So for any statement or value you have, to say what will you allow, what's permissible, what is on the table and what is off the table. So if he talks about, going back to the healthcare provider and doing no harm, might say we'd never use AI to make recommendations that do not consistently outperform best doctors. But the other example I like to give is to talk about what this means is the area around privacy. Now we could say privacy, what you say, you connect the value to what you see as ethically permissible. You might say we will never sell our customers' data to third party. Or you could say we will only share anonymized and aggregated data to third parties. Or you could turn around and say, we will give users full control of the data we collect about them. So looking at this, there's three different, I guess, flavors of privacy, two different ways of organizations looking at them. Both are fine. Both are open for discussion and like that. There's nothing with it. But I guess it's trying to identify what does that mean to your organization. And lastly, he just talks about articulate how you will realize your ethical goals and avoid your ethical nightmares. This talks about the why, the what, and the how you'll do. You talk about the structure you put in place, how you educate employees, specific roles and responsibility. This is a really nice way to work through, and you can very rapidly sort of start to say, okay, start the conversation, something that makes sense to people, but also that tie it to that broader sort of the company's mission and vision. And it works really well. And what you end up with something like this is you can end up something with like an ethical North Star. We have company North Stars, we have product North Stars. It's that thing we aspire to. It's that thing that will guide the project as it moves forward. So if we develop an ethical North Star, one of the big things happen, we talked about the why, what, and the how, but how do you actually start to put this into an organization? How do you make it part of the organization's culture and infrastructure and processes? Well, in most organizations, actually, I should say in all organizations, there is some way of managing risk. There is some process, there is some framework. It could be with cybersecurity, it could be data, it could be legal, but there will already be some framework we're doing. And rather than bringing another framework and process over the top, I would say that the best thing to do is to say, how do we weave that ethical framework within that? How do we work through it? So we're not adding some extra thing for it. We're just trying to help sort of people move through it. So we're going to give ethics a seat at a table and then say, okay, how do we actually within that? So we're not trying to put another layer of governance. The other thing we're going to try and do is I will say ethics is a team sport. So to create some sort of ethics council, ethics committee, and you include that sort of cross-functional team in there, as cybersecurity, data, all those people, they can help guide and organize, say, what does ethical AI look for our organization and how do we actually start to roll it out? Going to shift to talking about a few of the activities and things that we actually start to do, some of the more tactical things that you can start to do with it. The first thing I'd look at this and say, look at these tools is the ethics canvas. I love a canvas. I know Amir loves a canvas. I find this is a really good artifact for a product team or an organization to start having a conversation with it. It asks some really good questions. It gives you that sort of structure to have that conversation and also creates that point to actually start to document. So that's a really nice place to start with. It's a really well thought out canvas. And there's lots of useful things online that will help you use it. The other tool I found really interesting is dichotomy mapping. This is specifically when you have a product And what you might list out, okay, here's the new features building, or this is what we're doing. And then you just simply say, hey, what do we see as potentially could be harmful? And then what do we believe will be beneficial? And you just try to sort of map out the two differences between those, and you start to go, what are the gaps and how do we actually start to mitigate them? I mentioned before that Australia launched its AI ethics principles back in 2019. You can go online, just a simple Google, you'll find it. I found this really, really interesting. It sort of goes beyond that thing of just ethical nightmares and actually starts to allow you to have a much richer and a bigger discussion as we move through it. One of the things I found really interesting as doing it, I guess, in the practice, is that when I sort of was involved in doing lots of, I guess, generative AI experiments, we looked at things like proof of concepts, and we had these challenges where people were very excited we'd create something, but we struggled to go from, I guess, the experiment to productize it. How do we scale with what we're doing? And what we found is that there were key stakeholders and there were executives who had what I would call critical questions. These were things that came up because they actually were really important or they came up really frequently. So we developed this sort of workshop. I did it with this with my design colleagues, Erin Beale, where you would turn around and say, okay, let's identify the critical questions. Let's say, what principle does that relate to? Is it, it could be around privacy or transparency or fairness, like bias or contestability or accountability. And so we would then take them through that principle and explain what that does. We would give them some context and sort of a bit more information about it and the importance of it. And then we would give them an example. And it might be an example of like, for them to try and work out what went wrong here, or this is the downside of it, or things like that. And then we would have an activity. This activity could be something from the ethics canvas. It could be like involving dichotomy mapping. We also invented games like bias hunting. But there'd be activity where you would work through, and it helps people understand. So you give them that context, and then they're actually starting to do work and trying to understand the mitigation and what can they start to do. And then we end up with tips. We would give them some tips as well, but also they would then generate their own tips and talk about what they do that the next time. But I guess it was a really useful exercise using the AI principle framework that allow us to actually then work through and say, okay, an organization, here are your mitigations. You need to go away and start working on that, and gave them a nice framework. I'll just call out one in particular that I worked with, human-centered values. Now, that's one of the principles for it, and it talks about AI systems should respect human rights, diversity, and the autonomy of individuals. There was some wonderful work done last year by NAB and the Human Rights Commission, and they created this human rights impact assessment tool, and it was specifically for AI in banking. One of the things I really liked about it, it said it's not a new framework, it's not a new governance layer, but they said this is what you need to introduce to your current AI governance process that you have. And what it did is it presented 43 questions that the teams and individuals could ask during every stage of that sort of planning, production, deployment, and use of AI. And the questions are things like, are there groups with data set that may be underrepresented in the data and require special considerations? Or what ongoing testing and monitoring is planned to ensure fairness continues to be assessed? I found this really useful, and I've actually used those questions. I'll actually use it in my own practice. I go through and we share with them. But I just think if you're looking for some questions and an overview, it's a really nice way to start, and also shows you the impact of AI ethics, the fact that we're actually talking about human rights. So it's something you should definitely check it out. So we've looked at AI ethics. We've looked at some the processes that you can introduce. We've looked at tools and things like that. I guess, what does it really like? Because this talk is about trying to go from compliance. We've talked a lot about what does compliance look like, but to help organizations move to competitive advantage. So this first thing, I was lucky enough to go to a Salesforce conference last year. I haven't had a lot to do with Salesforce. A lot of clients use it, but I actually haven't designed or built or developed with it. And I was struck by, they talked about their positioning was, so they said data plus AI plus CRM plus trust. They had a value that was prominent first and foremost. And I found out this later. Trust has been a big part of a Salesforce platform for many years. So Salesforce have this AI called Einstein, and they really wanted to sort of talk about build trust into it, let people know. They actually have this thing called the Einstein Trust Layer, if you want to sort of go and check that out. I like it because it not only shared about what they do around privacy and things like that, but also talked about writing prompts and how do you write better prompts to get better answers and things like that. So they're actually starting to address not just the technical side, but they're actually trying to address the human side and things like that in trying to make sure we maintain that trust. But I thought that for an organization that's leading with an ethical value, I thought that was quite impressive. Next one I was going to talk about is Anthropic. You may know them better as the creators of the AI assistant Claude. And they've created this thing called constitutional AI, which is an approach to developing AI systems that embed predefined ethical principles and behavior guidelines into AI's training process, with the aim to create more predictable and value-aligned artificial intelligence. I really like this. Again, you can go check it out and read about it, but it's this sense of having that ethics through every step of the process. It's in development, it's embedded in training, where they're looking at that. We make sure that, the idea of trying to make sure we get predictable and value-aligned answers as we go through it. So I thought that was really impressive. Again, you look at things like Google, and there's, I guess, the other biggie, you've got OpenAI. They have slightly different approaches. Speaking of which, I just want to talk a little bit about two different approaches. And again, this is just as an organization or an individual, as a group or as a team, you have to choose which way that you would like to go. So when Apple built its Siri AI, it was made sure that it was built completely around privacy and safety. It's made sure that it does as much as possible on the device. It makes sure that, they have over 1 billion people using Apple devices. So I guess they didn't want them to expose to the risks and the weird behavior and the hallucinations of large language model. They wanted something that worked well, but was extremely private. So they took what they call a co-pilot approach, which is, small on-device model. But it also means it has limited capabilities. On the other side, you've got ChatGPT. I don't know if you've seen its new voice capabilities, but this is using a large cloud-based model, very human-like interactions. It's very capable, it's very flexible, but privacy takes a back seat in it. So I guess just want to share this, that there are two approaches two organizations have taken. When you go through, this is part of what ethics can help you with, is understand what those trade-offs are and help you move through as a team to say, okay, which way do we go? What is right for us and what does that look like? So obviously Apple's ethical nightmares are probably quite different to Sam Altman's and OpenAI's. Another organization that leads with ethical principles, IBM, they've got three. Talks about the purpose of AI is to augment human intelligence, not replace it. Talks about data and insights belong to their creator, so they're not benefiting from those sort of data and insights. And the last thing is technology must be transparent and explainable. IBM have done a whole lot of work. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later in this area. I think they've got their fingers burnt through IBM's Watson a few times. I really like their open approach they're doing. And this last one, I'm going to start this last case study I'll leave you with, slightly different. This comes from WITFM. You've got to be careful how I say that. It's a public radio station. It's a television station, online news broadcaster in central Pennsylvania. And what was interesting is they have this statement before select news coverage. It says, WITF strives to provide nuanced perspectives from the most authoritative sources. We're on the lookout for biases, assumptions in our own work, and we invite you to point out any that we may have missed. I thought that's quite extraordinary coming from an organization to say something like that. And I don't know about you, but you sit there and go, what does that make you feel about the information you might be receiving from them? And for me, it comes into something like trust. They're being open and transparent and sharing this. This last bit I'm going to talk about of this talk is going to be specifically around trust, because I've mentioned a lot. It's going to pop up a lot when you sort of look at AI, and it's a really complicated word to unpack. It's very challenging. Joe, how can you trust an AI system? If we think about how our reacts with how we go, our relationship with humans, we don't always trust humans straight away. And if we can't always trust humans straight away, we're all even less likely to trust the AI system. Can trust it with my information, my inputs. Can I trust the outputs it's giving me? Well, some information. This is research that came out from Salesforce. They did a global survey, and they looked at the C-suite believes that trust unlocks AI value for business. And this trust, they said 65% of global C-suite said that trust in AI would play a role in driving revenue. 67% said trust in AI would play a role in driving competitiveness. And 64% said that trust in AI would drive a role in driving customer satisfaction. So these people these C-suite people who are creating this strategy, who are sort of, I guess, driving these AI initiatives, saying trust is absolutely critical to achieve these things and will help us achieve these things. So if we're looking at trust, how do we actually start to break it down? How do we try and get our heads around it? So looking at this, I'm going to talk about two different things. One's cognitive trust and one's emotional trust. Now, cognitive trust is that rational, logical assessment. It can be based on, the AI's capabilities, performance, reliability. We can look at accuracy rates, algorithm. It's that sort of technical, sort of left brain sort of understanding. On the other side, you've got that emotional trust. You've got that subjective and feeling-based feeling. It's about our perception of it. And if you think back to some of the case studies I showed you where what that radio station was doing, they're probably appealing to your emotional trust. If we look at things that Salesforce are doing, talking about trust and displaying it, they're probably a bit emotion, but they're also probably going more cognitive. So we can start to play with these two things to say, like, how do we get people to trust us and engage with us? So there was this study published in the Journal of Hospitality Marketing and Management. I'm going to talk about it so you don't have to read the journal. I mean, it's fascinating. Please do if you want to, but don't worry. They ran this little experiment where they did a study where they described a product using AI. You'll see some TVs here. They also did it with vacuum cleaners, consumer services, and health services. And what they looked at is the people's propensity or intention to purchase based on, whether it has AI or not. They found three things really interesting. The first one, that including the AI term in a product description generally decreased purchase intention. The other one they looked at is the emotional trust that helped mediate the relationship between the AI term inclusion and the purchase to intention. And the last one is this negative effect. So people saying, you're talking about AI, I don't like it, I'm not going to purchase it. It was much stronger in high-risk products. So if we're talking about healthcare and customer service potentially, rather than the low-risk ones. So from this, I sort of built this little pyramid where you can turn around and say, well, if someone has an intention to purchase or intention to engage, if you bring in AI ethics layer, if we can put those values and those principles in, it will actually bring you emotional trust and people will purchase. And probably here's a simpler way to do it. Now, I've used a flywheel. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept of those things that spin around really fast, but it's this idea of this thing that gains momentum and then it becomes sort of self-perpetuating. It can move through. So the way I look at this is if you can actually build ethical AI practices that will increase emotional trust with your stakeholders, your employees, your customers, your users. As you build that emotional trust, you actually get that higher intention to purchase, or maybe a higher engagement intention for engagement. As you get that, you then get purchase growth, because ultimately we are trying to drive customers and we're going to try and drive revenue. So you get that business growth. As you get that business growth, you can actually provide further investment into AI. You can say, ethical AI, what can we do? And then as you get that further investment, you can keep building your AI practices as you're moving through. Last slide here. I guess it's just to call out that, if you jump in and start reading it, it can be slightly overwhelming trying to wade into AI regulation, AI ethics, responsible AI. So I guess here's my advice. If this is something you've found that's really interesting, where do you start? The first one, to understand AI ethics, you have to understand something about AI and you have to understand something about ethics. I can't say this hard enough. You please do some AI foundational learning. Amir talked at the beginning, Academy XI, do this. You have to understand it. You might have been able to skirt around working in digital products, not fully understanding the technology. It's really critical that you understand and you get a baseline for language that we're moving through with this. Once you've done that, start looking at AI ethical principles. You look at what the Australian government's done, it's fantastic. Look at things like the ethics canvas. Is this something that you think that you could start to include with your team? When you've done something like that, it's going to be really important to find some ethical AI allies. I said, let's create some nerdy Avengers. How do we create that crack team with all the different superpowers that you have, but actually sort of start to go, let's work together and say, how do we do this within the organization and what does that look like? So make sure you find your ally, because this will be like a lot of things, digital transformation. It's hard to do alone. It's easier to do it with a team. Next thing to do is look at something like look for business value. Look for competitive advantage. We talked about that justifications at the beginning, but what can I say to my stakeholders or execs within the organization that will get them interested and go, okay, that's important to me. How do we actually start to tie this back into the strategy? And lastly, this is a piece of advice that I've used again and again and again. Scare them, inspire them, start small. So yes, we can talk about the scary stuff and you can talk about the ethical nightmares, but talk about that ethical North Star. What's that thing they want to get? And they go, yeah, I want to work hard. It's worthwhile working towards this. And the last thing is start small. What's that smallest thing that you can start doing? Whether it might be introducing the Canvas, maybe it's like doing some online learning. What's that thing you can actually start to do to move people through this?
Awesome. David, thank you. Is that the mic drop?
That is a mic drop. I have to breathe now. Sorry,
That's a mic drop. No, awesome. Thank you. Couple of things that really resonated with me was ethics as a steering wheel. I love it, and I can just visualize it. Is they use it to guide the decision, and the decisions you make. That's brilliant. I like this notion of the North Star, right? Because often people think this ethics, you got to do it now, like accessibility, you got to do it now. If you don't do it now, you can't proceed, right? You can't go to the next step until it's done. Whereas in reality, like anything, good accessibility design and ethics, you put the flagpole somewhere in the future and you work towards it, right? So it's not a binary, you either have it or you don't. It's constantly working. I think that's really important. Yeah, Anthropic does great work. Yeah, the ethics, the ethical, the constitutional AI they follow, it's something that we cover in our workshop. But it's, interesting. I think over 60 points, like, constitutional points or principles that they use also, I guess, humans to help evolve. And that happens within the black box before the black box is wrapped up. So I think it's really good. Now, questions. I've got a couple of questions, but in case people didn't see it, Daniel put a post and put a question around, in your view, to what extent do you think AI implementation practices in Australia will be guided by local regulations versus overseas laws? I've put a link there. So the federal government does have a statement that they've put out. They're still working through looking at what different countries are doing. There's sort of different approaches to take. And I think David put some stuff in there, but there's definitely some voluntary, mandatory, and then some actual laws as well within the website. So definitely check it out. But I don't know, David, do you have anything else to add on to that in terms of Australia's position?
Yeah, I guess that's it. Part of this is if you start to look at implement AI ethics, you're going to get a head start of where they are. Everyone is still struggling. I've said that the US had an executive order, the EU have their framework. So everyone's kind of waiting for it. There's lots of frameworks and information out there. It'll actually, your ears will start bleeding when you start reading it. It is that quite challenging. So it's one of the things I'm saying that it's a team sport. First thing I'd do if you've got an ethics committee, go grab a lawyer, make them part of it, make their the first recruit to your Avengers team. Looking at that, but as we know, with like if you're dealing with data, if you're doing things globally, you've got to do GDPR. So there's already global regulations that influence what we do.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think most, again, having done my reading, most countries are using the principles from sort of human rights as a foundation to drive their sort of ethics, governance, and policies. So um, they're not sort of inventing the wheel from scratch. But I think you touched on it, but maybe I was going to ask you a question. You talk about go and recruit the right people in your team. I often get asked during the workshops we run is, who's responsible in the end? Either you're a startup or you're working in an enterprise and you're within a squad or a team of, product designers and BAs and product managers and technologists and solution architects and whatever. Within that group that's responsible for that product line, product stream, or even feature, whose role is it? I don't know if I've got an opinion. We've talked about this, but I want you to share your thoughts.
You look at role. I think so. Part of this is we're trying to make if we move from compliance to something like stewardship, everyone has a role in it. I look at that going, for me, naturally, I can see designers, human-centered designers taking a lead in this because of our experience sort of dealing with sort of creating that sort of North Star, trying to design with principles, bring people along, trying to get that sort of that alignment happening. So I see that as product people absolutely critical to this because they're actually doing the products, they're actually delivering these things that have to fit within the sort of regulations. With that, developers are really important when we talk about responsible AI. We're talking about algorithm bias and data. So kind of like everyone has a role, but again, you need to have someone who, like this sort of ethics committee or an ethics council, they need to take a role as they move through, and they will then sort of guide and help inform, upskill, and train people.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And again, it's like anything, right? Good design, human-centered design, we try to democratize that, right? So the entire team puts the human at the center of the design. When it comes to digital accessibility, again, we want everybody to own it, not one person. So I think it's probably a similar approach in terms of ethics, Dave, right? I'm waiting for any more questions to come up, so I've got another one. Why are we so obsessed, rightly or wrongly so, about ethics in this new emerging tech, AI, but we probably haven't given it as much love or attention or airspace when it came to the smartphone when it came out, or Web 2.0 and 3.0, or social media, or other emerging technologies that come up. And maybe we haven't been looking into it, but I get the sense that when it's regarding AI, ethics and all the stuff that come around it has been more heavily talked about and discussed as opposed to other technologies that might have as equal amount of attention required in terms of the ethical sort of concepts. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, what was the question?
That was a long one. Why are we spending and obsessed with AI ethics, but not other emerging technology ethics?
I guess if we look at if we look at traditional technology, we knew what the inputs were, we know what the output were. We're very familiar. We've done computer programming over many, many years. The challenges we have with AI is that first thing, it's built on large amounts of data, and we don't always know what that data's like. There can be inbuilt problems, whereas other sort of the technology we haven't done before hasn't had that. The other thing is has the ability to do this at scale and at speed, which a current technology hasn't experienced with. We also look at generative AI. As soon as you talk about that, the first thing we hear about is hallucinations. I've built many, many apps. We haven't had to worry about hallucinations before, whereas we do that now. So that's where this brings in new challenges, new concerns, and it's nothing to do with the reflection of people's skills and abilities of what they used to do. It's just we're dealing with this new thing.
Yeah, interesting. I was talking to a bunch of people, and when it came to social media, there's a sentiment that we lost that battle. We created social platforms. Maybe started with Facebook, and not too much attention was given to its positive or negative implication, and then it's gone rampant, and now every 5-10-year-old is on TikTok and everything else, and hence we lost the battle on that one. But definitely when it comes to AI, maybe we need to take a driving seat. Another question I've got, it's a bit quiet in the QA front, but I think
No, I've got some here. I've opened. There's a
Oh,
few.
sorry. I've just noticed. Yes, there's a bunch of here. Yeah. Go, maybe just
Uh,
answering them. I had the wrong tab. My
Right.
bad.
The first one says, "Hi Dave. From what I understand, ChatGPT daily power usage nearly equals 180,000 US homes. What are my views on sustainability?" Jacob Nielsen wrote a really interesting article where he talked about if he wants to create a image, what would take. He normally sort of have to go and get a designer or an art director to create an image. It would take them 2 or 3 days. He did like that energy consumption of what it would take for a human to do it, versus when he just talks into Midjourney and say, "Can you give me 10 images around that?" So he's actually broken it down. And when you look at that, the energy of having a human spending 2 days on it versus Midjourney spending 60 seconds on it, it's very different, the breakdown. Yes, it is something we should be concerned about. But I also think there are advantages to ESG. Same again with programming. If it's 30% faster to program with ChatGPT, you would have to imagine that energy consumption of that programmer sitting at their laptop in their office or whatever should come down as well.
No, good point. I do apologize. There's a bunch of questions. Let's look at Mariella. What's Australia's posture in regards to companies established to farm bots and use them to influence and manipulate advanced views on people? Well, that's a big one. Not you can get 3 minutes.
Yeah. All right. Where do we start with that? This comes back to if we talk about the AI ethical principles, and there actually is that sense of where you say, what is that impact beyond that? So for me, if you're going to turn around, if you've got 10 people in customer service and you want to sack the 10 people in customer service and you want to put an AI bot in there, you've got to say, what kind of organization do you want to be? Do you want to be a computer-led, computer-organized, no human type organization? Is that what you're trying to do, is get your employees down to zero? That is the question I would ask. When does it stop? What do you want to do? Or is it like, okay, well, how do we help this? There's also that challenge as we're going to run out of time. I can talk you through ethical implications, because you watch job satisfaction goes down when you get bots answering the easy questions, leaving customer support to answer the really difficult, challenging, draining questions. So again, this is why you have an ethical framework, and this is the discussion you have around it. But yeah, again, I can give you examples of companies that have just sacked the whole support force and said, support workers, and let's just go in with the bot.
Thank you. Look, I'm happy to stick around for another 5 minutes, David, if you are. We've got some good questions. Kate, if you identify a data set bias, for example, an underrepresented group, how do you counter that without introducing further biases?
There are some really nice responsible AI tools that you can do to actually go through your data sets, and it will actually call out whether you have a bias in there. But it also works well as the team. So if you're working with a data scientist, that question of in this data set, who do we think is underrepresented? Who doesn't this reflect well with? If we look at what our customer base, what we want to go to, and our potential one, again, this is why we need to bring business in it, because what are the questions they have? And then we say, let's go through and have a look at this. But there's a lot of really, really good tools I'm aware of that they have out there where you can actually start doing that. But it starts by asking those questions. Start with that hypothesis around bias, that yes, we are reflecting our group, and this is the customer base. These are the type of people to attract. And then you make sure you then you actually go through your data set and say, is it reflective of that, or are we creating that bias?
I will, George has asked if you can share that. That'd be awesome, but we can take it offline, David, and I can always get it off you. I can find it. Another question. Do you recommend shaping an ethical AI framework around the 3 challenges of bias, privacy, and explainability? By all means, you can answer, but obviously Australia's got their position, but this sounds like probably more of a question at you.
I think that's a really good way to start. Again, start with your organization. What are those critical questions? Where are the concerns they have? I've just done it. I could have easily done it through the AI ethical principles. I think they've got 8 of them. I could have gone down through the 8. I just grouped them into the top 3 concerns. And I guess that's where I start. I start with the concern the organization have. It's that starting small, and then I expand to bring in that other things. Don't bring in complexity straight away. start it simple, and then just, I guess, in your own head, you then have to say, okay, we're moving towards this. What else do we need to know? I just don't want to scare people when they start these conversations.
No, yeah, interesting. Maybe I'll have a crack at this one first, Jun. Trust in AI is an interesting topic. Since AI is built by humans, how would you classify who takes accountability? Well, 100% the humans need to, right? And even if you're using large language models or third party, as David had mentioned, you need to have a sort of oversight, right? Humans need to be the center, be it your organization. So you need to be able to either understand or seek to get the large language model suppliers to explain, as much as they can, how the output is generated, because at the end of the day, it's your responsibility and you've chosen that vendor. So you need to be 100% clear. Same with the due diligence you do with any vendor, be it SharePoint or, Apple products and so forth. But yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is make sure when you look at accountability, you look at the life cycle of the product. A lot of people will just have someone accountable for planning, someone actually accountable for development, but there will be no one accountable as it goes to support, or we will lose that gap. So that's one thing I find people will tend to miss out on. Look at the life cycle of the product, and at every step, every stage, who is that individual who's accountable.
Yeah, great. Look, it's 1:32. David, how much time do you have to stick around?
I can keep going for another 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. I just want to ask, will it be a good practice to run sensitive information through AI? Wow, that's a definition of the sensitivity, but anyway.
Really good exercise when you are looking at AI, go look at its privacy policy. There's a bit of learning exercise with you. What does it tell you? What's it going to do with the information? Will you maintain that? And then you make that call whether you're comfortable with it and the organization you're dealing with. What will happen if that information gets out into the real world?
There's a question by Anonymous around morals, and I feel like that's a half an hour one. So I might park that and we can always try and respond via LinkedIn. Frankie, if you're in an organization that's maturing its data strategy, infrastructure, or governance capability, what would you recommend product teams do to work with that gap when building out the ethics and governance frameworks?
Yep.
Yeah,
So I guess this comes back to when I talked about trying to have maybe something like an ethics committee. They're the best ones with that situation. You need context of the organization, what works in the organization, what do they have existing already, would be working through it. That's probably where I would go with that. It's horrible, but it just says it depends. Without knowing the organization and the situation, I can't work out. This needs to be a bespoke situation to what you're working through. And I guess that teams, it starts with, let's start the conversation. Who's that person interested? What's that business case we're moving through? How do we start upskilling people around AI and ethics?
Last one here by Daniel. Maybe I'll answer this. Do you expect companies Australia to start appointing chief AI officers or setting up an AI ethics committee? 100%. That's already happening. Like, I know a couple of chief AI officers, and often they're sort of co-joint with chief risk officers. At the board level, I think sort of the Australian Institute of Company Directors already have a lot of content in there that they train their sort of directors around governance and risk, which is a sort of general term, but I think encompasses this, and that's going to probably form into the curriculum moving forward. But I don't know, David, any other additional thoughts on that one?
In the US, they're already getting chief AI ethics officers are appearing. Larger organizations, the people using these sort of developing these foundational models, they've already got those people in there in place. There's a few organizations in Australia that do it, but it's something that's been more problem. Again, competitive advantage. This can give an organization that advantage compared to other people who aren't going as far with this.
Awesome. I think I'm going to call it there. There's a couple other questions. Amanda's asked about a completed AI canvas example, but maybe the ethics example, sorry, but maybe you can we could take it offline, David. But
Yep.
Awesome conversation. Again, I think this is one of those sessions we should have allowed 2 hours, not 1 hour. And great to see engagement by everybody. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned while we talk over the coming week. I'll share what our next AI webinar will be about, but just a virtual clap to David for his time and thought leadership.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. See you, everyone. Bye-bye.